My name is Richard Dolan. I write books about UFOs and related matters. Probably the best title would be simply historian/author. I've been researching the UFO phenomenon for about 20 years. And when I started, I, at the time, was working on a doctoral dissertation in American Cold War history. It had nothing to do with UFOs in any way. My life at that time was filled up with Harry Truman and the Cold War and the birth of the CIA and relations with the Soviets and all of that, circa 1950. I stumbled into a bookstore and saw a UFO conspiracy book, a famous book called Above Top Secret, The Worldwide UFO Cover-Up. And it was that subtitle that got my attention, The Worldwide UFO Cover-Up. I thought, well, that's interesting. Because even then, everyone had heard claims of UFO cover-ups and things like that. And I thought, this is a period of time that I study a great deal in my professional life. And in the academic world, of course, UFOs just don't come up. They're never discussed. But as I browsed through that book, I thought this is a fairly serious treatment of a topic that just is completely blown off by the academic world. And initially, my thought was not even to figure out if UFOs were real. I simply wanted to know, is this a matter of historical interest to the national security power structure of the United States ever? And if it was, then why had it never been in any academic history book ever? How would that not be interesting? You go back to 1950, and if it was true, as some have claimed, that Harry Truman was receiving briefings on the matter of flying saucers at that time, well, then my goodness, I thought I'd like to know about that and find out. So that got me started. It was a pure intellectual curiosity. And what I found quickly was that, indeed, this did appear to be something quite serious. There was a number of declassified documents that we had access to, courtesy of the Freedom of Information Act, primarily when that act was useful during the 1970s. And as a result of that, there's quite a bit of information that's available. And it, in my opinion, it proves, it doesn't hint, it doesn't suggest, but it proves, not that UFOs are necessarily alien, although they might be, but it does prove that the UFO topic was serious, that UFOs did absolutely exist and were recorded and noted in military documents of the 1940s and 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s and beyond. So that it represented something that wasn't supposed to exist, and yet here you go, you've got the document showing it. So to me, it was how do I put this? It was an indication that there was indeed a cover-up. There was something important. The government was basically lying and saying there's nothing to this, and yet in the classified world we see evidence to the contrary. That's what got me started 20 years ago. And from that, I wrote a 500-page history book called UFOs and the National Security State, and that came out in 2000. That really got me started in this field, and I've been going ever since. In the years that I've been doing this, my head is now filled with all kinds of UFO data, stories, claims, allegations. The thing that struck me in the early years was not necessarily so much the specific cases, but it was very clearly the attitude that was evident in the declassified documents. So, for example, many of them did describe violations of sensitive airspace by unknown objects that were apparently disc-shaped, that had incredible capabilities. One, for instance, took place over what was called the Hanford Atomic Energy Commission plant. That's in the state of Washington. And one of the release documents we have is from 1950. And it describes very clearly, since a certain date, it said, objects round in form have been sighted over the Hanford plant. It goes on to say, Air Force jets attempted interception without success. Anti-aircraft battalions have been alerted. Jet interceptors have been alerted. The FBI has been alerted. Army intelligence has been alerted. Investigation is continuing. Now, I think that's rather interesting. One of the interesting things about that document was several. One is that this is clearly there's a very serious tone to this document. Two, it just describes intrinsically something very bizarre that's not supposed to exist. What are these round objects that are over a sensitive nuclear facility. In 1950, there were not that many nuclear facilities in the world, and they were very, very important. So what are these objects doing, essentially hanging out over that? Third, it said, investigation is continuing. Well, that's very nice, but there's been no follow-up documentation that we've been able to get. So it tells me that there's still secrecy about this. Whatever the conclusion of the investigation was, we don't know what it is. And then just the fact that if that document had been released at the time, back in 1950, you have to think how explosive that would have been. I think the American public and the world public would have been very interested in knowing that round objects are invading sensitive airspace, jets can't intercept them, and they've alerted anti-aircraft battalions. Yeah, I think that's quite interesting. But all of this was kept under wraps for many, many decades. And when that document was finally released in the late 70s, well, by then, unfortunately, we'd become kind of a zombie nation. And the information just basically got buried in the news media. No one really thought about it. Well, now in the last few years, I've continually moved in new directions in this field. When I started, it was very nuts and bolts. I was looking at documents, I was looking at military encounters. I'm still interested in that. But the UFO phenomenon is like a huge ocean. And, for me to remain in one aspect of it would be like going to that ocean and putting your big toe in the water and then saying, okay, that's enough. I think I've had enough water for my time here. Well, I'm not that way. So for the last many, many years, I've been swimming in that ocean. And what I mean is this is a strange phenomenon. So particularly in the last, let's say, 5 years, I've looked at a lot of different aspects of this. I've looked a lot at abduction phenomenon. I've had many people, I continually have people who write to me all the time, describing very, very intense and inexplicable encounters that they seem to be having. So over the years, I've collected quite a few of these cases, and I interview these individuals. I don't do hypnotic regression, but I do try to do a thorough interview and try to get the information out from them in as calm a manner as possible. And people have told me some amazing stories. My general direction is, I guess I could call myself a UFO researcher generalist. In other words, I really do try to look at the entire phenomenon and all of its myriad aspects, and I try to make sense of it. So my training is as a historian, but I'm also, I think, very philosophical about this. And I'm always asking myself, what does this mean? I have come across a number of very new, interesting cases that I don't think other researchers are aware of. I've written about a few of them. One comes from a contact that I have in the Canadian military who told me of an encounter from 2008, not that long ago, when he was stationed at the absolute northernmost human habitation in the world. If you look at a map and you look at Greenland and you go to the tippy top of Greenland and then you make a quick left, you're on Canadian territory. And there's a base there and it's called CFS Alert. That stands for Canadian Forces Station. This base was built in the 1950s as a listening post against the Soviet Union. It's still active. They probably still spy on the Russians, but they also communicate with nuclear submarines in the area. Anyway, he was there in January 2008 and described to me in some detail of an event that shook up everyone at the base. And it was a 200-foot-long cigar-shaped object that silently came over the base from the south, hovered, shone this intensely bright white beam of light down on the base for about 10 minutes, turned off the beam of light, and then flew silently off over the frozen Arctic Ocean. Now you have to understand, this base is remote from everything for many, many hundreds of miles. To fly an aircraft, particularly in the middle of the black Arctic winter, particularly after there had been several days of really bad weather, which they had, for this thing just to do what it did, there's nothing that we know of, not drone aircraft, not anything, that has this type of performance capability. and then to fly over the Arctic Ocean where there's literally nothing for thousands of miles that we know of. I've interviewed this man at great length. I am quite satisfied that he's truthful, and we're trying to get some corroboration of this from other people who are at the base. But I consider that a very interesting case. And when you think about the implications of that, well, what is this? You know, it doesn't seem to be Russian. It doesn't seem to be Chinese. It doesn't seem to be anything that we know of. So what agency is behind this? So that's a fascinating case to me, and that's just one. I get a lot of individuals who come to me with stories like this. One other that I included in my most recent book, UFOs for the 21st Century Mind, comes from a retired U.S. Navy guy who had been stationed in the Pacific back in the 1960s. He, in the early 60s, had been part of something called Operation Dominic, which you can look this up on Wikipedia. Operation Dominic was a program in 1962 over 6 months to detonate 36 high-altitude hydrogen bombs up in the upper atmosphere off the coast of Hawaii. When you think of this, I mean, I don't know what these guys were thinking. Yeah, nothing could go wrong with this. 36 high-altitude hydrogen bombs in the upper atmosphere off the coast of Hawaii. It's incredible. So he was part of that. And a couple of things he said to me. One was, every time they would be ready to detonate a nuke up there, they were always seeing bogeys. That is UFOs, so unidentified objects that were in the upper atmosphere that would be there right up until detonation, and then just before that, they would all disappear. So it certainly appeared that there's some group of something that was monitoring this, that was important to them. All except in one case. Apparently one did not get out of the way soon enough. Because what he described to me, this was in October of '62, right after the conclusion of the Cuban Missile Crisis. One of the objects came down. And he had some information about this. Actually was an eyewitness to it. He was brought up on the ship. They'd all been below deck during the test. He and a few other people were brought up to stand on one side of the ship, dealing with all the sea spray coming at them, and they were ordered, look straight ahead and observe. And what he saw was an enormous object moving at a horizontal. He said it was much larger than like a football field. It was quite large. Moving this way. He wasn't allowed to turn his head to see where it went. But he learned from the radar people who had tracked it that the U.S. Navy was sending several vessels, vectoring them in to the location where this object went into the water. Sometime later, he met a Navy diver who was the first man into the water to investigate this object. And what that diver said to him was he was lowered down in those old-fashioned diving bell suits and was standing on the object before he realized that he was actually standing on the object. He slid off of it, lost his footing, slid off, and looked at it, and it was so large and so intimidating to him that he actually lost bladder control in his suit. He just couldn't hold it in. And it was somewhat translucent, or maybe even transparent, and said that what it looked like was inside was like a honeycomb pattern inside this thing. Well, that really distressed him so much, they had to pull him up shortly after that. And that was the sum total of his encounter with that. They sent divers down the following day to do a follow-up investigation, and the word was that the object was no longer there. So apparently it was let's call it a failed attempt at a crash retrieval. So, these types of stories, they're all around us. They're everywhere in our society. And what I find is that most people will have some incredible encounter like this, whether it's a military encounter or a personal encounter with what appears to be a being. And then what happens? They don't talk about it. Like ever. Or hardly ever. They don't even tell family members. Who do you really tell when you have some incredible experience like this? Often they tell no one. And I find that actually disturbing. I mean, this is sometimes the most amazing, dramatic, and sometimes traumatic event in someone's life. And yet, because of social norms and social pressures, they don't feel like they can talk about this openly. And to me, that's a sign of a problem in our society. It seems to me that when there's something important that's going on, we should feel free that we should be able to talk about it publicly. But I think the reason that there's this social taboo about talking about it is simply because it starts from on top. This is a matter of national security. National security interests collaborate with major media. They collaborate with the academic institutions. They certainly have got their watchdogs in those. And they put the word out. This is not a topic that is ever supposed to be taken seriously. It is only supposed to be treated with ridicule. And so that creates a cultural pattern, which then takes on a life of its own. And I really believe that's what's happened. For the last several years, one of the directions that I've been taking in the field of UFO studies is kind of a field that a lot of other people have been looking at, which is, let's just call it the relationship of the UFO phenomenon to things like consciousness. There's been a lot of influx of what we might call New Age thinking into ufology or into the study of UFOs over the last generation. And I mean, my feeling is that there's something of a mixed results there. And it's been important for me in my own thinking, and particularly in my newest book, which is called UFOs for the 21st Century Mind, to really get a handle on this and understand what is the relationship, how important is this, and so on. You know, when you look at old-fashioned UFO research, they didn't really get into this at all. Researchers of the 60s and 70s and 80s and even into the 90s, many of them were just really focusing on recording sightings, looking at some of the military aspects, the technological aspects, and so on. It's all very important. But what you find, especially since the 90s, is that there's been a new, very strong focus by a lot of people on whether it's something as far out as channeled information. You get a lot of this now. Or people who claim to get, they'll use the phrase downloads. They'll get a telepathic download from some source. And, you know, a lot of things related to this. And my initial instinct as a researcher is to really put that as like much lesser valuable evidence. And part of me still feels that way because getting evidence like that is inherently difficult to verify. You know, something may happen to me, and I may know and feel in my inside that it happened. But now how do I prove it to other people who don't know me? I mean, that's the problem of evidence. And that's a significant issue. And the fact is because a lot of information that is so-called channeled is I think, complete nonsense. And some of it may not be. I personally am very persuaded that every single human being has some level of what we would call psychic ability or psi ability. I think that's probably universal. I do think some people are very gifted, like some people are very gifted with musical ability, and other people with psychic ability are more or less a little more tone deaf, let's say. But everyone's got some. Now, it's interesting to ask, what does that mean in terms of what reality is? If you're able, as a remote viewer, let's say, to get a vision, an accurate vision of something that's far, far away from you, in space or in time, then what does that say about the whole nature of reality? So to me, this is a very important question, and I've been asking this for many years. And I think to get a really sophisticated understanding of what the UFO phenomenon is, we have to ask this question. So there are ways of people obtaining information through these types of means. But it's also very possible for people to get wrong information that way. I mean, if you were to listen to every single bit of channel information that ever came your way, I think you would be a very confused person because they don't all agree. Having said that, you know, I do think that there's probably something to it. So the real question that I've been asking myself is, how do we handle this as evidence? How do we deal with this as truth? To what extent can we work with it? And, you know, on one level, everyone has to decide that for themselves. But for me, as a researcher, and I try to be very responsible, I take a middle road. So I think, on the one hand, I tend to be very open to listening to evidence for people who get information in these non-traditional ways. But also I still feel that to be responsible, we should not be dogmatic about it. I guess the biggest problem I will have with people like this is when they are adamant that the Pleiadians, for example, have told them that this is the nature of reality, this is how it's all going down. And when someone gets very, very dogmatic to me about it, I tend to kind of shut down when I'm talking to them, because I think, you really don't know. And even if they were to give you this information, why do you think it's necessarily accurate information? The Pleiadians, if they're actually communicating with people, may be telling them not what is necessarily true, but what they think that person needs to hear. Could be different. If you and I were to time travel back 1,000 years into some medieval village, how much of our world could we tell them without their heads just going pop? Could we tell them that the earth revolves around the sun? Doubt it. That simple thing would probably not be acceptable. Could we tell them that the earth is probably billions of years old? No. Could we tell them about things like microorganisms or viruses? No. We could tell them very, very little about our world. And that's with their best interests in mind. So any other intelligence that's here communicating with people, I think we should understand that that's not necessarily true information anyway. One of the main reasons I'm open to kind of non-traditional ways of getting this information, when you look at through abduction research, all right, one thing that actually is totally consistent every single time is that the person who's had this experience has a kind of telepathic communication with these other beings. This is every single time. So you're in your situation and some other being comes up to you and you get complete thoughts from this other being, and they're basically talking to you in your mind. And that sounds very, very unusual. I mean, we don't have that experience in our daily life. But this is constantly discussed in abduction research. So it seems to me that these other beings are intensely telepathic. This is an important part of what they are. And it seems to me that, just as a guess, that might be one reason that they would abduct certain types of people, perhaps people that are more interesting to them, who might have stronger psychic ability. It's just a thought. So I think that consciousness is important to these other beings and their relationship to us, and I think it's somehow very important in this whole matter. I mean, after all, you have cutting-edge scientists now who are arguing that consciousness is really the foundation of our reality in some important ways. If that's so, then yes, consciousness is very important in the UFO field too. But again, the issue comes down to dealing with it in as responsible and careful a way as we can. And it's like walking that line between dogmatic, like saying, I know exactly what this is, and the other side saying, well, we can't test it, so therefore it doesn't exist. All right, let's walk that path, realizing that we could very well be wrong about some of the things we think about it, but also willing to explore it. And that's really where I'm at these days. I would never want to study the UFO phenomenon as a separate thing from like just the larger philosophical questions that I always ask myself about what it's like to be a human being here on planet Earth and what is the meaning of life and all of that. To me, that's really the core of what I'm about anyway. And the UFO phenomenon is just one way for me to explore these issues. One thing that I always try to impress upon people is that this subject it's not a trivial subject. It's not a simple hypothetical like, gee, what if there's life out there in the universe? All right. When we're studying the UFO phenomenon, what it really means is that there are others. They're not just out there. They're actually down here on Earth. And they certainly appear to be interacting with humanity and this world in a very intimate way. And that this signifies, something very important. They're interested in us. And in fact, we're fascinating. I think that what we are at this point in our civilization is probably the greatest show in this part of the quadrant of the galaxy. You think about where we've gone in the last 2 centuries. Just 200 years, that's nothing, right? 200 years ago, our whole human civilization, anywhere you looked, was horses and wooden carts. Horses pulling wooden carts. And we go from that to locomotives, to cars, to airplanes, to radios, to televisions, to nuclear weapons, to guided missiles, to computers, to iPods and iPhones, to advanced nanotech, to advanced artificial intelligence, to very soon quantum computing and next generation 3D printing, which is going to be able to print organic materials and nanoparticles. Holy smokes. 200 years, actually less, we've done that. Our civilization shot up like a rocket, totally indistinguishable from anything that we can see that preceded us. Anyone who's got the ability to observe us must understand that we are poised right now to leap right into their world very quickly. So I think if they're watching us, they must be aware and monitoring us, maybe managing us. If I were them, maybe that's something I would want to do. I would think, wow, these humans are rather aggressive. They're developing some increasingly dangerous weapons. The electromagnetic, blasts that they put out with their nukes have maybe messing up the operation of our craft, for all we know. So let's get a handle on these people. So I think that's actually a real possibility of what's going on. And then when you think of UFOs in what we might say an existential basis, that is, these beings, all right, they're not like us. Not in intelligence, not really in emotional disposition, doesn't seem to be. They represent something, we could say alien. I don't think that's a bad word for it at times. It seems to me that in understanding this phenomenon, our interaction with them, ultimately, I think what it comes down to is I hope that we can obtain a better sense of what we are, who we are as a species and as individuals. I wouldn't want to study the UFO phenomenon if it didn't bring me back to the questions of really what is the essence of humanity? What is it? What are the important things about human life? By studying these other beings, or by at least reflecting on what these other beings might be like, I like to think that we can gain insights into who we are and maybe a better philosophical perspective about how to live a truly mature phase of our existence. Anyone who's interested in my work should go to my website, which is richarddolanpress.com. That site has a lot of my own work on there. It's got the introductions of all of my books you can just read. Lots of articles I've written over the years, links to YouTube videos, all of that. I also publish books by other really interesting, brilliant, cool authors who are also in the same general field. It's a small but growing publishing company. I enjoy doing it. And you can see all of the other authors who are there, and they've all got their own page there. So it's kind of an active, growing site. That's richarddolanpress.com.